Now, the nervous tissue itself, the key cells that we're looking at are neurons. And these are the nerve cells, and we have billions of them, specialized to send messages. And they have two major regions. They have a cell body, which has the nucleus and metabolic center, and they have processes that extend from the cell bodies. Now, when we were talking about muscles, you know that those cells can have nuclei all over, which allows them to repair fairly easily. When we have neurons, since the nucleus is located just in the cell body and we can have processes that are 2 meters long or more, we have situations where it can take a very long time for a material used in repair, and again, this is in the peripheral nervous system, it can take several days for materials to go from the cell body down the processes. Functional characteristics of neurons, they are irritable. That is, if you stimulate them, they will respond. They will respond by sending a signal. Muscle tissues are also irritable, but they respond by contracting. Now, so you could say if someone's irritable that you're on their last nerve, possibly. Anyway, also conductive. They have an ability to transmit an impulse down the length of that nerve. Other characteristics, well, structurally, a neuron looks something like this. We've got a body. We've got a single axon that goes out, and now that axon may have branches that go off of it, but we have a single axon that goes out. So basically, a neuron can send a signal or not. Now, to decide whether it sends a signal, it gets input from dendrites, and you can have thousands of dendrites going in. So a cell, I think on average, has about 6,000 separate dendrites that goes to it, and it's the accumulation of input that says do something or don't do something that decides whether we end up sending a signal or not. Now, nervous tissue, again, neurons. We've got a nucleus, and we are producing proteins in form of neurotransmitters, other things. So there's a large nucleolus which is associated with production of ribosomes. And we have the processes. Dendrites, which conduct impulses toward the cell, axons that conduct impulses away from the cells. So this is a one-way system. You do not receive a cell down an axon any more than you send a cell through a dendrite. Again, just the graphic to give you an idea of what we're looking at. Now, axons, axons don't touch other axons or other cells. There's actually a very small gap in between the axon and the next cell. And so an axon ends in this thing called an axonal terminal, and when a signal goes down the axon, it actually causes a release of neurotransmitter into that tiny little space. And that space is referred to as the synaptic cleft. A synapse is the axonal terminal, the synaptic cleft, and the receiving side. So we consider all of that the synapse. But what will happen is that we'll release the neurotransmitter into that space, and it actually has to diffuse across that gap. Now, nervous tissue, myelin sheath, which is basically myelin's fat. It is the phospholipid membrane wrapped over and over and over again, covering the axons. So, yes, when someone refers to you as a fathead, they're actually being fairly accurate. Schwann cells, located in the peripheral nervous system, do this in sort of a jelly roll-like fashion, and there are gaps between called nodes of Ranvier. And it is basically the nerve signal hopscotching over the nodes of Ranvier, which allow the signal to move faster. Basically, Schwann cells allow much faster transmission. And it looks something like this. You've got it that wraps around the axon. And this is not a process that is completely finished when you're born. So you don't gain control over certain body systems until you get the myelin sheath completely made. That's basically why babies urinate just as soon as their bladder's full. They don't have any control yet over that reflex. Now, most neuron bodies are found in the central nervous system. In fact, about 90% of the bodies associated with the nervous system are within the central nervous system. And in the brain, that would be gray matter. That is the cortex, which is cell bodies and myelin or unmyelinated axons and dendrites. And then we have nuclei, which are also clusters of cell bodies within white matter in the central nervous system. And when we look at the central nervous system, we'll look at those a little more closely. We also have structures that are called ganglia. These are sensory nerves in the peripheral nervous system, and they have their cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. They actually run in rows along the spine. So we have basically ganglia outside of each vertebrae, or the space in between each vertebrae on both sides. We can classify neurons functionally. So we have sensory neurons. They carry impulses from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system. And we've got a couple of different types. We've got cutaneous sensory neurons. And we have proprioceptors. Now, the cutaneous neurons, that's stuff that's in the skin that we can pick up touch reception. The proprioceptors are buried in muscle and tendons, which will detect if there's muscle stretch, tendinous stretch. It will give us a better sense of where our bodies are. When I was growing up, we were told that we had basically 5 senses. We had taste, touch, smell, hearing, and sight. Sorry, drew a blank there. Now we really consider there to be 6, and we think of our body position, our understanding of body position, as sort of a 6th sense. So now ESP would be the 7th sense, I guess. Anyway, and then we have motor, which is efferent, and all I can think of is efferent, E for exit. That's leaving the central nervous system. But these carry impulses from the central nervous system to your muscles, your guts, your glands, and control their activity. We do have some functional classification of neurons. We have actual exposed dendrites. We've always heard that if you get on an exposed nerve, it's most sensitive. Essentially, these carry sharp pain sensations. We also have Meissner's corpuscles, which are encapsulated, and they are still very sensitive to light touch. We have Pacinian corpuscles, which are also encapsulated, but they are encapsulated by a lot more stuff, so they respond to pressure. And then we have those sensory neurons associated with proprioception, which go into muscles and tendons and things like that. And in between those sensory and motor, we have interneurons. And these connect the two and allow for us to process the information and see if it's something that needs to be acted on or not. Now, this is sort of an example of an interneuron. And so we have sensory here. We have the cell bodies of sensory neurons in a ganglia, which is outside the central nervous system, and then they carry their signal to the interneuron, which is located in the gray matter of the spinal column in this case. The white matter in the spinal cord, those are myelinated axons, which carry information to or from the nervous system. In this situation, we may have like a simple reflex whereby, I've got a sensory nerve in my foot, I step on a nail, it passes that information to this interneuron. And, we're getting information to the interneuron all the time when we're walking, but it's not really intense. But if it gets intense enough, then that interneuron will kick a signal out to a motor neuron, which will allow us to take our foot off the nail. And because we have these interneurons in this case located in the spinal cord, we have rather rapid reflexes. We don't have to send a signal all the way up to the brain and have it processed up there and then send it back down. This can save a few milliseconds, which reduces the amount of damage that's occurring. We also, of course, would kick a signal up to the brain from this just to let us know you've just stepped on something, don't do that again. So that pretty well summarizes what we're looking at in this chapter in terms of, or not this chapter, but this section of this chapter in terms of the cells that are actually involved. So hopefully you found this helpful, and we have additional presentations later on in this unit, covering both the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, nerve signaling, and other aspects.